I'm going to focus on Labour politicians. In previous talks, I've covered communists, social reformers, Republicans, and various other assorted individuals. I'm going to focus on Labour politicians since the First World War, but I'm just going to start off by saying a little bit about the origins of the Labour Party in the Dulwich and East Dulwich areas. There was a branch of the Independent Labour Party in East Dulwich as early as 1894, which had committee rooms in Wakeley Road. It had a number of individuals who were active in it, this mainly being local artisans. The treasurer, who stood as a candidate for the London, the local vestry. This was before Camberwell Council was established in 1900, was Edward Cray, who was a local pavior. It's understandable, perhaps, that he wasn't necessarily successful in being elected. The Independent Labour Party was much stronger in the north of the country rather than in London, and it was an ethical socialist party with a large amount of religious influences. In contrast with the Social Democratic Federation, which was stronger in London, where there was a Camberwell borough branch from 1886, and then a East Dulwich branch from March 1892. That branch didn't last very long. The Independent Labour branch was reformed just before the First World War. There were two radical clubs in the area: the Dulwich Working Men's Radical Club, founded in 1887, which was based in Hounslow Road, and then there was also a Peckham and Dulwich Radical Club based in Rye Lane, founded in 1885, though that closed down in 1896, having become insolvent. The radical clubs are important. They had links into the Liberal Party. They were basically working class organisations linked to the Liberal Party, but gradually some of the individuals in those clubs moved over to the Independent Labour Party and the Social Democratic Federation. As I said, Edward Cray stood both for the London County Council and for the local vestry a number of occasions without success. The first individual, however, I'm going to focus on is Harry Quelch, who was a trade unionist living most of his life in Nunhead, and I'm including him because he stood 4 times between 1885 and 1900 as a candidate for the London School Board on behalf of the Social Democratic Federation. He wasn't successful, but he's significant because he was one of the leading working class members of the Democratic Federation at a national level, which became the Social Democratic Federation and adopted a Marxist position, the first English Marxist organization, under its leadership of Henry Hyndman, who spoke on occasions at the Southwark Radical Club. Quelch took over from Hyndman as editor of Justice, the Social Democratic Journal. He wrote a number of pamphlets for the SDF, including the Catechism of Socialism, which together with Ernest Belthorpe Bax. He died in September 1913 at his home in Nunhead, and was buried in Camberwell Old Cemetery. And this is a picture of his grave, and you can just about read the rather grim, dirty inscription there. His son, Tom Quelch, who was born in Nunhead and then moved to Wimbledon, was actually a founding member of the Communist Party in 1920, and actually went on to be one of the British Communist Party's representatives in Moscow on the executive of the Third International, established under the leadership of Lenin. The second individual I'm going to mention is Russell Smart, who lived when he was very young in West Dulwich and actually was educated at Dulwich College, though he only seems to have stayed in the college for a year. His family then moved to Brixton. He started his career as a solicitor, then as an actor, and then became a sanitary engineer, focusing on heating and ventilation. He always wanted to be an MP and stood various times for Parliament, though he was never successful. He joined the Social Democratic Federation and also the middle-class socialist body, the Fabian Society, and then later joining the Independent Labour Party on its foundation in 1893, while retaining his membership of the Social Democratic Federation. In that period, the ILP and the SDF sometimes actually collaborated, so you could be members of both. His main role was as a prolific socialist pamphleteer. He worked with the then ILP leader Keir Hardie on a pamphlet setting out the policies and programmes of the Independent Labour Party. Keir Hardie then going on to become the first socialist MP. He wrote numbers of pamphlets on trade unions and politics, socialism and drink, the economics of temperance, on municipal socialism, socialism and the budget, one on the right to live, and interestingly enough, given his background, a pamphlet in 1909 on socialism for the middle classes. He was on the radical side of the Independent Labour Party and actually left the Independent Labour Party in 1911, arguing at the time that the ILP had become too autocratic and controlled by those ILP members like Keir Hardie, who were members of Parliament. He was never actually a Marxist, but nevertheless joined the Social Democratic Federation and actually became deputy leader at one stage to Henry Hyndman of the Social Democratic Federation. He actually, with Hyndman, supported Britain's involvement in the First World War, in contrast with the Independent Labour Party led by Keir Hardie, which was opposed to participation. He died in 1923, actually having moved even further to the right, joining a sort of pro-war party called the National Socialist Party. An unfortunate name, perhaps. Right, I'm then going to moving on to Arthur Creech Jones. He's probably the most significant Labour Party person with Dulwich connections, or with strong Dulwich connections, I should say. He was secretary of the Dulwich Independent Labour Party from 1912. He was also secretary of the Camberwell Trades Council, the Federation of Trade Unions. He was actually born in Bristol, but he joined the civil service and worked as a clerk in the War Office from 1907. Before the First World War, he lived at 46 Keston Road near Goose Green, and then in the 1920s, he moved to 79 Red Post Hill on the casino estate. During the First World War, he was a conscientious objector. In fact, he coordinated the South East London branch of conscientious objectors, and he was served several years in prison as a conscientious objector, not being released until 1919. He was very active as in the trade union movement, and was elected the MP for Shipley from 1935, sitting as the member till 1950, at which point he lost his seat and then was elected again for Wakefield in 1954, staying as MP till 1964. He was very well. His main interests were in colonial self-government. He was very active in the Fabian Research Bureau and then in the Fabian the Fabian Colonial Bureau, which he helped form in 1940. During the war, he was parliamentary private secretary to Ernest Bevin, the Minister of Labour in the wartime coalition. With the election of the Labour government, he became Under Secretary of State in the Colonial Office with George Hall as minister. And then the following year, he was actually promoted to Colonial Secretary as Hall had been given a peerage. He was basically a supporter of adult education. He was a strong believer that in the idea that the Africans could achieve self-government so long as they actually were supported through educational programs. He, in many ways, is regarded as the minister in the Attlee government who moved the basically the British Empire into the Commonwealth, becoming less of a centralized colonial organization. He supported a range of African nationalists, many of whom became prime ministers of their own countries in 1960 and 1961. In my view, he's actually the sort of most forgotten and most significant member of the Attlee government, and rather bizarrely, as yet nobody has actually written a full biography of him. But he, as I say, he lived in Dulwich for most of his life, and it's interesting that even as a cabinet member, he lived in a council house on the casino estate. Somebody who was also a cabinet minister, but this time in the Ramsay MacDonald governments much earlier. That's from 1924 and then 1929 to 31. Jimmy Thomas, who was secretary of the National Union of Railwaymen, becoming MP for Derby in 1910. Holding his seat until 1936. He was one of the leading trade unionists and regarded as one of the top 4 leaders of the Labour Party through the 1920s. He was involved in all the major strikes, both before and after the First World War. He was appointed originally a colonial secretary. He was also at one stage Lord Privy Seal and Dominion Secretary, and he lived at 125 Thurlow Park Road from 1920, a property that was bought for him by the National Union of Railwaymen. He actually maintained his position as General Secretary of the NUR through most of the period he was an MP and sitting in the cabinet. He was, when the Labour government collapsed in 1931 and Ramsay MacDonald became Prime Minister under a national government, Jimmy Thomas followed Ramsay MacDonald and was then rewarded with the position of Dominion Secretary, which he kept right through to 1935. At that time, he was also obviously expelled from the Labour Party and also lost his trade union position. He died in his Dulwich house in January 1949. The newspaper obituaries tended to focus on anecdotes about his habits. Even his friend and colleague Philip Snowden, who was Ramsay MacDonald's Chancellor of the Exchequer, could get a laugh out of his audience by commenting, "I calculate that Mr. Thomas spends 150 days of each year attending lunches and dinners of various societies, smoking 320 cigars and consuming 9 gallons of champagne, with a laundry bill for starched shirts of £18 a year." That was a lot in those days. David Lowe, the famous left-wing cartoonist at the time, always referred to Thomas as Lord Dress Suit because he liked dressing up. And in fact, one anecdote had it that King George V boasted a post-operative wound laughing at one of Thomas's rude jokes just before the 1929 election. The chapter on him in the book is called Jimmy Thomas, Trade Unionist, Minister, Drinker and Golfer, because he was also president of the Dulwich and Sydenham Golf Club in his retirement. I think the reference to drinker was edited out when the article was published in the Dulwich Society Journal. Right. Thomas Kennedy is not in the book because I only recently discovered his local connection. He was a Labour chief whip in 1927 to 1931, though he didn't seem to have full cabinet status. He was MP for Kirkcaldy boroughs in Scotland for most of the period between 1921 and 1944, though you can see there that he lost out in a couple of elections for a couple of years. He's significant in that he was one of the old guard of the Social Democratic Federation in the before the First World War. He actually made numerous attempts to stand for Parliament, for example, in 1906 and 1910, unsuccessfully. He was originally the Scottish organiser of the Social Democratic Federation, based in Aberdeen, and then came to London as the national organiser in 1913. He fought in World War I. As it was the case with Russell Smart, he actually supported the intervention in the First World War, and like Russell Smart, actually moved from the British Socialist Party into the National Socialist Party. He also edited the Social Democrat, which was the SDF, Social Democratic Federation Journal, or newspaper, I should say, in the successor to Justice. So he was appointed a Privy Councillor in 1931 and died in March 1954. Again, there's no biography of him. Interestingly, his son, who was also called Tom Kennedy, who was actually born in Mount Adam Park, was a civil servant, became Professor of Economics at Makerere University in Kampala in Uganda, and published a sort of short biography of Henry Heinemann, the SDF leader, who was a very close colleague of his father. Unfortunately, he didn't actually publish a biography of his father, which might have actually been more interesting. Right, I'm now going to move on to 4 Labour parliamentary candidates. Labour didn't really organise itself in the Dulwich constituency until after the First World War, by which point the Independent Labour Party was really part of the Labour Party, and generally, except in Scotland, didn't really run separate candidates against the Labour Party. So the first Labour candidate in a parliamentary election for Dulwich was Charles A. Smith, who was the unsuccessful candidate in the 1924 general election. He won 27% of the vote. He stood again in the 1929 general election, increasing his vote to 30% of the total. I should stress that right through the interwar period, as before the First World War, the Dulwich seat, otherwise known as Camberwell South, was always won by Conservatives. The Liberals nearly got in once in 1906, but the Liberals have never won the parliamentary seat, irrespective of all the boundary changes. And as I'll come on to later, Labour didn't actually win the seat till 1945. Charles Andrew Smith was born in Bishop Auckland, studied at University of Durham and University of London, was a school teacher teaching in Wood Green. He was then a tutor for the Workers' Education Association, and rather bizarrely, the leading British anarchist, Albert Meltzer, was one of his tutees. He served in the Royal Army Medical Corps during the First World War. In the 1920s, he lived in Clapham, very active in the Clapham branch of the Independent Labour Party, and he was on the left wing of the ILP, actually working very closely with the Communist Party, the local Communist Party, actually in the Balham and Tooting area, was very much managed by a small group of British Trotskyites. It's actually the basis of British Trotskyism. For those that are knowledgeable on that rather obscure subject, they will recognize the names of Red Groves, Henry Sara, and Harry Wicks, who are otherwise known as the Balham Group, the founding group of British Trotskyism. Smith became editor of the Independent Labour Party's internal newsletter called Controversy in 1933. He was much more, he was active really in a range of left-wing organizations. At one time, he actually was chair of the Independent Labour Party, which in 1932 disaffiliated from the Labour Party on the basis that it didn't think the Labour Party was left-wing enough. And then in 1943, Charles Smith actually then left the Independent Labour Party and joined the Commonwealth Party, which was a small Christian socialist party which stood candidates for Parliament during the Second World War at a time when the Labour Party wasn't standing candidates because of the agreement for the main political parties not to contest seats while the war was underway. What I put on the slide is a book by one of my friends, Ian Bullock, which is a study of the Independent Labour Party in the interwar period, but also one of Commonwealth Party's pamphlets, this one on the famous Beveridge Report, the basis of the national insurance system as we know it, and the welfare state. So Smith, although again, no biography of him, very little coverage except in footnotes of rather obscure books on various bits of the British left, but quite an important character. Interestingly, right through the interwar period, the Labour candidates were not local candidates, probably because it was regarded as somewhat of a hopeless seat. And in fact, none of the individuals who stood managed to actually get elected in safer seats later in their political careers. The second Labour Party parliamentary candidate in Dulwich was Fred Hughes, who was a clerk. He stood, as I say, here in 1931, but was defeated by the sitting Conservative MP, Frederick Hall. He got 16% of the vote, so somewhat less than Charles Smith got. His main background was as General Secretary of the National Union of Clerks, which was effectively at the time the main civil service union. He was active, as you can see from the poster, in the campaign against sweating. Herbert Elvin, who spoke at that National Union of Clerks open air meeting before the First World War, that's 1909, I think, was actually General Secretary before Fred Hughes. He was also involved in general campaigns for equal pay and published, contributed to a document called the Clerks' Charter, Comradeship for Clerks. He had actually stood unsuccessfully in North Lambeth in 1923, but again, his kind of political career was not very successful. He stood again for Chelmsford in 1935, again losing to the Conservative. My next individual Labour parliamentary candidate is probably the most interesting of the four in the interwar period, and that is Helen Bentwich, who stood as the Labour candidate in the 1932 parliamentary by-election, which was called following the death of Sir Frederick Hall, who'd been a Conservative MP for the constituency right from December 1910. Bentwich came third place with 3,905 votes, just behind the Liberal candidate, C.R. Cook Taylor, who I think stood as the Liberal candidate in 6 or 7 different elections. Bentwich didn't actually live in Dulwich, but actually lived in Hampstead. Her involvement in Dulwich politics was very short-lived, but it's her unusual backstory and later career that makes her worthy of record, really. She was born Helen Franklin to a Jewish banker and his wife in Notting Hill, who were members of the Anglo-Jewish elite. Her uncle was Herbert Samuel, who was later Liberal Party leader, colonial secretary, the first High Commissioner of Palestine, and Home Secretary. One of her cousins was Edward Montagu, a radical liberal who became Secretary of State for India at the age of 38. Who together with Rufus Isaacs were the first three practicing Jews in the cabinet. Disraeli was of Jewish birth, but actually an Anglican. She started off basically as a kind of voluntary social worker, I think it's probably best to say. She then got a diploma in social work. She worked with a Girl Guides company next to Toynbee Hall in Tower Hamlets, most of the guides being Jewish and Yiddish speaking. She helped set up the West Central Jewish Girls Club in Soho for Jewish immigrant girls. Her brother Hugh became an active supporter of the militant suffragettes before the First World War, actually attacking Churchill with a dog whip and smashing windows, which ended up him being in prison. But an interesting family, really. When war was declared, Helen, who wasn't yet married, joined a territorial nursing detachment, although she wasn't a qualified nurse. But she then joined her new husband in Cairo, Norman Bentwich, who, after fighting in the Camel Transport Corps during the First World War, was actually appointed a legal advisor to the British administration on Palestine under the British Mandate. So she was very involved in a whole range of sort of community work in Palestine. However, before that, it's also worth mentioning that in the First World War, she joined the Women's Land Army, having also previously organized women to strike in the munitions factory at Arsenal. So you can see she had quite a sort of radical career. Now, later, despite, as I say, her unsuccessful attempt to get into Parliament, it's interesting that she appears only to have joined the Labour Party just before the 1932 by-election. And much of the attention, I mean, by-elections always get attention, but the fact that she was standing as a Labour candidate while her uncle, Herbert Samuel, was leader of the Liberal Party and Home Secretary, obviously got considerable attention. Despite not winning the seat, she then, in 1934, was co-opted onto the Education Committee of the London County Council. She tried to get into Parliament again in 1935 in Harrow, but again wasn't elected. But in 1937, she was then elected to the London County Council as a member for North Kensington, which she represented until 1946, then moving on to be member for Bethnal Green North East. And then in 1955, she then represented Stoke, Newington and Hackney North, standing down in 1965. She was appointed a CBE. She chaired the Further Education Committee of the London County Council during the Second World War, and was very involved in ensuring that the education that had been provided in adult institutes was continued in bomb shelters. She became chair of the LCC Education Committee from 1947 to 1950, and in 1956 she became chairman of the London County Council, term chairman being used rather than chairwoman, and was therefore sort of acted as hostess to various visits by international dignitaries such as the Soviet leaders Khrushchev and Bulganin. She was very active in supporting Jewish refugees right through her life. In the 30s, she became organizer for the movement for the care of children from Germany, that is for Jewish refugees from Nazism. After the war, both her and her husband supported the Jewish falashas in Ethiopia, many of whom managed to move to Israel. She was involved in a whole range of public positions, trustee of the London Museum, Whitechapel Art Gallery, Council of Industrial Design, Army Education Advisory Board, and so forth. And she died in 1972. Her husband published a number of books on Palestine, and together with her husband, she published the memories of their time in Palestine, called Mandate Memories, 1918 to 48. She also published a whole series of her letters that she actually wrote from Palestine during the Mandate period. The last of the four parliamentary candidates in Dulwich for the Labour Party was Jim Delahaye, who was the candidate in 1935. He, not surprisingly, was defeated by the sitting Conservative MP Bracewell Smith. He actually got 26% of the vote. The Liberal Cook Taylor standing yet again, coming third. He doesn't really seem to have had substantive connections with the constituency. His only comment, I think, in one of his election speeches, that when he was at Hailbury School in 1908, he was in the team which played rugby against Dulwich College, which isn't really a very strong connection if you're standing as the Labour parliamentary candidate. He grew up in Crowborough in Sussex, went to the Royal Military Academy, served in the army in Ireland and South Africa and France during the First World War. And then he effectively became a diplomat, quite interesting career. In 1919, he went to he was a member of the Inter-Allied Mission to the Baltic. He was British military representative in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. He says he was focused on reporting on conditions in Soviet Russia, but you may be aware of the fact that we were actually invading Soviet Russia at the time in an attempt to bring down Lenin's government. In 1921, he returned to Britain, working at the War Office, focusing on studying the education of officers, having been promoted to the position of Lieutenant Colonel. He then worked for the Ministry of Labour, working on conditions of the unemployed in South Wales, studied at the London School of Economics, investigating the problems of international finance. And then in 1931, he was asked by Viscount Cecil, the League of Nations advocate, to organise a central disarmament bureau. So he was actually then put in charge of the disarmament department of the League of Nations Union, which that through this period was very active in obviously promoting international diplomacy and basically solution of international disputes through arbitration rather than through war. He basically went around the country speaking for the League of Nations, but he then got rather sort of diverted by a rather odd individual called Dimitrij Mitrovic, who was a Serbian philosopher who, though based at the Serbian embassy in London, advocated a metaphysical utopia drawing on the philosophy of Plotinus, Clement of Alexandria, Lao Tzu, and the German Christian mystic Jakob Bohm. So he ended up being an advocate of this kind of rather curious form of mysticism and psychoanalysis, working very much with Gurdjieff and Uspensky, who some of you may have heard of, and then got involved in the New Britain movement, advocating the concept of a threefold social order, a concept developed by the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner, based on the notion of equality in political life, freedom in cultural life, and cooperation in economic life. Moving further into sort of the areas of mysticism, he developed an interest in the Iranian Zoroastrian mystic Meher Baba. At the same time, he was working with various political theorists, such as George Catlin, who was married to Vera Brittain, and incidentally Shirley Williams's father, and actually at one stage also flirted with the new party, which was Oswald Mosley's party before he set up the British Union of Fascists, and contributed to the New Britain Weekly, which was edited by C.B. Purdham, who was the town planner and Guards and City advocate, who had also moved towards fascism. So he campaigned for this New Britain movement for many, many years. He also, in 1934, was a member of a Church of England delegation to Germany, where he actually met Hitler and Dr. Rosenberg. But the New Britain movement disintegrated in early 1935. And he then sort of moved towards back to the left, I suppose, to the Socialist League, the new left-wing group established by Stafford Cripps. I mean, he was involved in various campaigns, the People's Front campaign before the First World War. Before the Second World War. He also remained interested in Russia, speaking on the Russian experiment and at a number of meetings, actually returning to Crowborough, where he previously lived. He doesn't seem to have written very much, although there's one sort of a series of political essays which I haven't been able to get hold of, but he did contribute to this pamphlet, Why They Joined the Fascists, written by one of his close friends, Lionel Birch. In his final years, he was a lecturer at the Army Bureau of Public Affairs. He also established during the war Freedom House in London as a central base for civilian discussion groups. He also worked for the British Council, being appointed the regional officer for South West England, based in Salisbury, and died there in January 1948. So another example of somebody who had an interesting political career, but is completely unknown in the history of left-wing movements, or unrecorded until now, I should say. Right, this other individual, John Beckett, some of you may have come across. He lived in Dulwich for a few years, I think, though I've not been able to trace his address. He was MP for Peckham between 1929 and 1931, having previously been MP for Gateshead. He was on the far left of the Labour Party. He'd originally been involved in work with ex-soldiers after the First World War. He became active in the Independent Labour Party on the left of the Independent Labour Party. His sort of main claim to fame was the fact that he, as a Labour MP, he picked up the mace and tried to carry it out of the Houses of Parliament, which apparently some of his constituents in Peckham quite liked. But in 1930 to 31, he sort of moved away from the Labour Party. He did try to stand as a candidate for the Independent Labour Party, and in fact, the Labour Party in Peckham split between Beckett's followers and the sort of official Labour Party. Early in his career, he was the secretary to Clem Attlee, before Clem Attlee, well, in the very early years of Clem Attlee becoming a member of Parliament. He interestingly married the actress Curl Bellow, who is the lady in the middle of the picture, who very confusingly actually adopted the name of a previous male actor, Curl Bellow. If you actually Google the name, you get lots of pictures of the male Curl Bellow, and then lots of pictures of her, because she liked modelling for pictures. She's got several images in the National Portrait Gallery collection, for example. She not was an actress, but actually managed the Strand Theatre. And John Beckett, having lost his parliamentary seat, became very active in the theatre world. But he then moved on to join the British Union Fascists, led by Oswald Mosley. I think he's somewhere in that photograph. You may be able to work out which one is Beckett. He then split with Mosley and actually joined the National Socialist League, run by William Joyce, later known as Lord Haha, who lived at Allison Grove. The reason I've included Beckett is because he was one of the leading, having been a left-wing socialist, he moved to the extreme right and was the main sort of speaker at a number of the fascist meetings, including outside Dulwich Library, and sort of in what is now known as Dulwich Junction, in the middle of the village. In the war, Joyce, of course, went to Germany to do fascist radio propaganda. Bennett was Becket was put in Brixton prison, and after the war, he was involved in various other kind of political initiatives, including the British People's Party, and he actually stood for the British People's Party in a by-election in Hythe in July 19. Sorry, he worked with the British People's Party in Hythe when their candidate was St. John St. John Philby, I should say, the ex-diplomat, Arabian explorer, Muslim convert, and of course known as the father of none other than Kim Philby. So the organisation was inevitably quite right-wing and promoting moved from promoting fascism into some form kind of European federation. So he died in 1964, having got very involved in Catholicism. His party actually stood candidates for the London County Council in Peckham and Camberwell North, though not in Dulwich, in 1946. But the British People's Party didn't last very long. And as I say, Becket spent his final years getting quite involved in a Catholic activity. His son, John Francis Becket, journalist, and I think currently editor of the University of the Third Age News, when I last looked, wrote a biography of him, which was actually republished relatively recently. There's another more recent version of it published last year called Fascist in the Family. So, somebody who moved from socialism to fascism and then to rather odd forms of Catholicism in his later years. My next individual is also a kind of rather curious character, Wilfred Vernon, who was the Labour MP for Dulwich between 1945 and 51. Not very significant as a member of Parliament, but he was interesting in the sense that in the 1930s, he provided secret aircraft information to the Russians. He was never actually arrested as a spy. And Attlee in the 1940s, when as Prime Minister, decided not to make it too public, but he carried on as MP till he lost the seat in 1951 and also continued to serve on Camberwell Council. Now, I've only got about 5 minutes or so left, so looking at my watch. So the last few I'm going to run through quite quickly. The Silkin family, Lewis Silkin was MP for Peckham between 1936 and 1950. He was at one stage leader of the Labour group on the London County Council before handing over to Herbert Morrison and then becoming the chair of housing of the LCC. After the 1945 election, he was Minister of Town and Country Planning and therefore responsible primarily for the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, which is still, to some extent, the basis of the British planning system. His son, Sam Silkin, became MP for Dulwich in 1964, serving until 1983, and was Solicitor General in the Wilson government. The younger son, John Silkin, was MP for Deptford between 1963 and 1974, serving as a Labour Chief Whip from 1966, and then becoming Deputy Leader of the Commons, became Minister of Planning and Local Government, similar to his father, and also at one stage tried to stand for leader of the Labour Party unsuccessfully. All three of the Silkins lived in various homes in the village throughout most of their life. Now, I'm just going to mention very quickly some other Labour MPs who actually lived in Dulwich, though they were not Dulwich parliamentary candidates or MPs. You had George Brown, who's third in the row, who lived in 77 Court Lane up till 1963. He was MP for Belper from 1945 to 1970, Belper in Derbyshire. He was a South Londoner, having been born in Peabody Buildings and living on the Peabody estate on Blackfriars Road. He became deputy leader of the Labour Party, having lost the Labour leadership, or the contest for the Labour leadership, to Harold Wilson, and he also served as foreign minister. Unfortunately, together with Jimmy Thomas, he's remembered more for his drinking habits than for his political achievements, which I think is somewhat unfair. The first individual in the top row is Leslie Hale, who was Labour MP for Oldham between 1945 and 58 and lived in College Road near Sydenham Hill Station. He was an active on the left of the Labour Party in the Tribune group and very much involved in sort of international campaigns for sort of the World Federalist movement. Also, interestingly, he was solicitor for the Spiritualist National Union and concentrated on trying to repeal the 1735 Witchcraft Act in favour of the 1951 Fraudulent Mediums Act. He was also very involved in supporting African nationalism and worked and visited some of the African states or would-be states together with the leading radical decolonial MP, Fenner Brockway. We've also got there in the middle Julius Silverman, who lived in Croxted Road until 1990. He was the brother of Sidney Silverman, probably better known because he was the leading campaigner for the abolition of capital punishment, interestingly working closely with Leslie Hale. Julius Silverman was MP for Birmingham, Erdington, then Aston, and then Erdington again for most of the years between 1945, actually for all the period between 1945 and 1983, serving in Parliament for 38 years. His main political activity was campaigning against slum landlords, promoting various housing legislation and rent control, and also was very active involved with the Indian nationalist movement. Bottom on the left, you've got Albert Booth, who was employment minister, lived in Woodward Road for 15 years from 1968, who was member of Parliament for Barrow and Furness between 1966 and 1983, and also Labour Party treasurer. Later in his life, he went into being a transport director in South Yorkshire and then for Hounslow Council, an odd example of an MP having a later career as an officer in local and regional government. He was also active as a Methodist lay preacher. And then the last person at the bottom is Christopher Price, who's Labour MP between 1966 and 1970, first for Birmingham Perry Bar, and then from 1974 to 1983 for Lewisham West. He was very active in education policy, and in fact, having lost his seat, he then went on to become the first director of Leeds Polytechnic and led its transition into Leeds Metropolitan University, serving as Vice-Chancellor until 1994. He died in February 2015. His sister, actually, Helen Jackson, also teacher, was a Labour MP for Sheffield Hillsborough from 1992 to 2005. And as promised, I will finish off with Tessa Jowell. Many of you will have known Tessa well as I did. Tessa was she was born in Marylebone, but studied at Aberdeen University and then at the University of Edinburgh, becoming a social worker, first as a childcare officer for Lambeth, working at the Maudsley, and then becoming an assistant director for the mental health charity Mind. She joined the Labour Party when she was only 22. In 1969, she was elected to Camden Council in 1971 and became chair of the Social Service Committee at the relatively young age of 25. She made various attempts to get into Parliament, but in 1992, she won the Dulwich seat with a majority of over 2,000 votes, an election which many of us will remember, and held the seat, which of course was renamed Dulwich and West Norwood in 1997. She held the seat until she resigned in 2015. She held a number of roles on Labour front bench: health spokesperson, spokesperson on women, and opposition whip. And then in 1997, with Labour being returned to power, she first became a Minister of State in the Department of Health, leading on public health and launching the Sure Start programme before moving into the cabinet in 2001 as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and being remembered mainly now for her role in promoting the London 2012 Olympics. She was a loyal supporter of Blair and seen as part of the new Labour leadership group. As a cabinet member, she supported Blair's decision to invade Iraq in 2004, which somewhat could cause certain difficulties within the Labour Party. But irrespective of her being seen as possibly on the right of the Labour Party, she was an extremely popular and hard-working constituency MP, even though, as I say, she didn't actually live in the constituency. She was involved in her later years in what was called the Blue Labour movement, a kind of conservative Labourism initiated by Lord Glassman, and contributed to a number of pamphlets by that group. She sought the Labour candidacy for the mayoral election in 2016, but that role was taken up by Sadiq Khan. She was always a campaigner for the National Health Service, and she died of cancer in 2018. A book based on interviews with her was published in 2018 called The Power of Politicians, and of course the Tessa Jowell Health Centre is named in her memory.